The real mystery about the Kennedy assassination, as far as I'm concerned, regarding the medical evidence, is what happened between the time the body arrived at an impossibly early hour, 6:35 p.m. What happened between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. when the autopsy record began? This is the key to understanding all the conflicts in the evidence, in the medical evidence in this case. The people who killed President Kennedy had a plan ahead of time. They had a patsy selected. The patsy had a location. It was a man in a building behind a man in a car, well above and behind the man in the car. A lone assassin scenario. That's the official cover story. So the medical evidence had to be made as much as possible to comply with this cover story.
I know now what happened. President Kennedy's body arrived at 6:35. It had just been flown to the Officers Club parking lot in a helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base. It was not in the bronze Dallas casket. It had been taken out of the casket as soon as the casket was loaded onto the airplane at Love Field. So these people were terrified that the cops would show up at any moment with Dr. Rose and demand the body and do an honest autopsy. One of the most dramatic moments was when the two FBI agents at the autopsy looked at the controversial back of the head photos of President Kennedy, which seemingly show the back of the head to be intact. And both Agent Frank O'Neill and former Agent Jim Seibert, Jim Seibert and Frank O'Neill, they both said the images of the back of the head that show the back of the head to be intact were completely wrong and did not look like anything they saw at the autopsy. And they both reaffirmed that they saw a large head wound in the right rear of the skull. So that was significant testimony because these guys were trained observers, and furthermore, they weren't wild-eyed conspiracy theorists, okay? These guys were J. Edgar Hoover loyalists. They both wanted to believe that Oswald had killed the president, and yet when we showed them these back-of-the-head photos, they said, no, that's not the way it looked, and they never saw anything like that night.
Welcome to the show again, Doug.
Thank you, Len. It's good to be back. It's been a while since we talked on the air, and I'm looking forward to it.
Do you want to just give a brief background of your interest in the JFK assassination?
When the JFK Records Act was passed in October '92, that really attracted my interest. And I worked on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, worked on the staff for the final 3 years of its 4-year run. So I was there for the last 3/4 of its lifespan, and I was hired as a senior analyst on the military records team, and then promoted halfway through to become the head of the military records team. So the job title was quote, Chief Analyst for Military Records, unquote. What it meant was I was a supervisory analyst in charge of 4 other people, and in that position, I was fortunate enough to be immersed in the taking of 10 depositions, autopsy witnesses or autopsy participants, people who were at JFK's autopsy, including the 3 pathologists, 2 FBI agents, 2 X-ray techs, a photographer and his assistant, and 1 person who developed postmortem photography later that weekend. So I was involved in that effort. That was our so-called extra credit work, was creating those new records and also doing a lot of unsworn interviews of all kinds of medical witnesses, like the family of Robert Knudsen. He was the White House photographer who developed postmortem photographs. And he was deceased, but we interviewed his family, and we interviewed Dr. Carney and Tom Robinson, one of the morticians, all kinds of people. That's what I was doing.
And let's mention that. Do you have a website right now?
Inside the ARRB.livejournal.com. I've been occasionally adding pieces to it, journal entries for approximately the last 3 years. So anyone can go there and just read through the progression of issues.
When you look back on the ARB, do you think it did a fair job? You know, in the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they always claim to be a little underfunded and they didn't have enough time and they wished they could have had an extension thing. So, by looking back on the AARB, how do you feel about it?
The Congress did not want to reinvestigate the assassination. And they wanted us to give a broad definition of what an assassination record was, not a narrow one, a broad one. So we gave a broad definition to it and located a lot of records. And the review board itself was the enforcement arm of the JFK Records Act. So without this temporary federal agency, bothering the rest of the government, I mean, nothing would have happened. So you had this enforcement arm whose job was to establish working relationships with the rest of the government and force them to account. The federal agencies who were willing to release a record in full, they just gave it directly to the archives. But any record that a federal agency wanted to withhold in part or in full, if they wanted to redact it, they had to give it to the review board staff. And then we would study it and compare it to the criteria within the JFK Records Act, and we would say to our board members, okay, the Act allows us only to withhold a record for reasons of personal privacy or protection of sources and methods or damage to the security of the United States. So the reasons that this agency wants to withhold this record are not sufficient, and so we would say, for example, we think that the entire record should be opened up, or we would say we think that 90% of this record should be opened up, and then the board members would vote. And we reviewed 60,000 records in that way, 60,000 records that other agencies wanted to withhold in part or in full, and the board members ruled on those. So I think overall, given the limitations of our mandate, we did a good job with one exception, and everybody's talking about the exception now, and that's fine. There are, according to Jefferson Morley, I think, and Jim Lazar, there are about 1,100 records that the CIA still has not released at all or has not released in full, and they're dragging their feet and going as slowly as they can, and so that continues to be a problem. But with that exception, I think, yes, the review board did a good job.
And for heaven's sake, don't reopen the investigation. I wish there would have been more people who really had a more suspect nature of the government, thinking that, well, we have real misgivings about the Warren Commission. We think the whole thing was a cover-up from day one. And
yes, I know what you're getting at. I'd like to make a comment, a couple of comments. Robert Blakey, the staff director of the House Select Committee, the second staff director after the first one was forced out, he wrote the JFK Records Act. The establishment nominated these people. The board members wanted to release all the records they could. They often released more than the staff thought should be released because we had all these provisions in the Act that said you can protect somebody's privacy, you can protect their name, you can protect sources and methods the government used to gather information, you can protect the national security of the United States, and some of them were kind of vague and open-ended, and they really wanted to release documents. I'm pleased that they let Jeremy and I conduct the 10 depositions of the autopsy witnesses because what we were doing was very close to reinvestigating. Now, we didn't write a report about what it meant, and we did not, reach any conclusions, but that's why I wrote my book, to tell people what I thought we learned about the medical evidence. Thank God they let us do them, and they only let us do them because Louis Stokes, the former chairman of the HSCA, sat and spoke to the board members right after they got confirmed in the Senate hearings and confirmed by the Senate, and told them that he knew that his House Select Committee had not satisfied anyone with the way it dealt with the medical evidence. He knew that. He understood that. And so he asked them to do what they could to clarify the record in that area. They let us do the depositions thinking that probably nothing significant would come out of it, except to clarify a few things here and there. None of them attended the depositions, and none of them read the transcripts. But they let us conduct them, and they also let Jeremy conduct some depositions of key CIA people who were involved in the Mexico City shenanigans. So
now let's get on to, probably something you really have a great interest in is these depositions that you sat in on with medical testimony, because that is kind of, I think, the highlight of what you've been writing about in your 5 volumes. Is this is a mountain of evidence that it's available, and people just have to start looking for it.
What I wanted to do in my book, in just about every area of the medical evidence that I could, was to provide the reader with an understanding of the new landscape of the medical evidence, the new state of the medical evidence after the ARRB shut down. When I look back at the book I wrote and at the research I did writing it, what I remember now are highlights, and that's what I'd like to maybe just cover here are some of the 5 or 6 major highlights. And what's disturbing is they're facts that the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about. The mainstream media and talking heads want to try to force opinions down our throat and belief systems, but they don't want to talk about evidence. And I would just caution everyone, anyone that wants to force his belief system down your throat or persuade you to believe his conclusions about the assassination without discussing evidence, he's not worth listening to. So here's some of these facts that we now know coming, this is the new territory, the medical evidence landscape coming out of the review board, looking at the entire big picture. There's about 18 autopsy photos, views, specific views of the body that are missing, okay? When I say view, there were usually 2 black and whites and at least 2 colors or more taken for each view. So you can multiply 18 times 4. That's a lot of missing photographs.
I just wanted to know, how did you come up with the number 18?
Did an analysis of all the testimony I could get my hands on from the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, and the review board. Not only sworn testimony, but staff interviews. So, like for example, the Warren Commission did a lot of sworn testimony, and the House Select Committee did both depositions and staff interviews. The review board did both depositions and staff interviews. So I reviewed all of those things, and that's a lot of people saying a lot of things. And if they're all correct, and if their memories are all correct, there's at least 18 views missing from the autopsy photo collection. That's a significant problem. Not only that, there are the X-ray technicians who took the skull X-rays. The petty officer in charge, Gerald Custer, of the 2-man team. He was in charge of the 2-man team. It was him and Ed Reed. Gerald Custer consistently said over the years that there were 5 or 6 skull X-rays. Sometimes he would say 6, sometimes 5. Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist who interpreted the X-rays for the pathologist, told Dr. Mantic in '92 that a JFK researcher, David Mantic, told him there were 6. So we know from what Ebersol said and Gerald Custer said over the years that there were 5 or 6 skull X-rays. Well, there's only 3 in the archive, so this means that there are at least 2 skull X-rays that are missing from the official collection. At least 2 skull X-rays that were taken and are missing. Now, Dr. David Mantic, he's visited the archives 9 times. Many of the listeners will be familiar with his work. He has concluded, through his studies with optical densitometry, he took his machine into the archives, measured the amount of light coming through the 3 surviving skull X-rays repeatedly, over and over. He did control experiments of his own. He's concluded that the 3 surviving skull X-rays that are in the archives today are not originals. They're altered copy films. So they are JFK's skull, they are JFK's sinuses and his teeth, but the images have been altered. And they're not originals, they're copy films. So my boss at the review board, Jeremy Gunn, was so intrigued by Dr. Mantic's research in this area that he allowed Dr. Mantic to propose questions for us to ask the 3 pathologists at their depositions. And those questions were asked of Drs. Humes, Boswell, and Fink. And based on the answers we received, my conclusion in my book is that Dr. Mantic's hypothesis is correct, and that those 3 skull X-rays are not originals; they're copy films. So that speaks to cover up also. Perhaps the most dramatic moment, one of the most dramatic moments. I guess there were 3 or 4 really dramatic moments. One of the most dramatic moments in the medical depositions we did was when the 2 FBI agents at the autopsy looked at the controversial back of the head photos of President Kennedy, which seemingly show the back of the head to be intact. And both Agent Frank O'Neill and former Agent Jim Seibert, Jim Seibert and Frank O'Neill, they both said, and we deposed them on different days, so they were in the room by themselves. Their testimony wasn't tainted by their former partner, So we had Seibert the first day, O'Neill the second day. They both said the images of the back of the head that show the back of the head to be intact were completely wrong and did not look like anything they saw at the autopsy. And they both reaffirmed that they saw a large head wound in the right rear of the skull. So that was very, large, and the size of your fist or the size of a baseball, that type of size. So not in a small entry wound. So that was significant testimony because these guys were trained observers, and furthermore, they weren't wild-eyed conspiracy theorists, okay? These guys were J. Edgar Hoover loyalists. They both wanted to believe that Oswald had killed the president, and yet when we showed them these back-of-the-head photos, they said, no, that's not the way it looked, and they never saw anything like that night. So I don't know how those photos were made. I don't know if the scalp was rearranged or if they're photographic forgeries, but they are not honest photographs. They don't represent what people saw at the autopsy, and the two FBI agents have blown the whistle on that. So that's really that's powerful, because those statements were made under oath, and they had no motive to spin a tale about it. But they told the truth. Now, Frank O'Neill had good memories of seeing the brain at the autopsy, and Seibert said he did not. But O'Neill had good memories of what the brain looked like after it was removed from the body, the night of the autopsy. And we showed Frank O'Neill the brain photographs, and he just shook his head and said, no, that doesn't look like what I saw. And so Jeremy Gunn said, why not? And O'Neill said, under oath, there's way too much mass present. He told us that more than half of the mass of President Kennedy's brain was missing in the brain he witnessed at the autopsy after it was removed from the body. And he says he looked at the brain photos in the archives, and he said, this looks to me like it's almost a complete brain. And in fact, he's correct. The photos in the archives show a brain that's been disrupted. It's been disrupted and damaged, but the mass is almost all present. And so he disowned those photographs. And he told us that the biggest section of mass that was missing was in the right rear of the brain. So these are significant statements. The official photographer, John Stringer told us what kind of film he used to shoot the supplementary brain exam. Let me explain what that is. A brain is removed from a body at autopsy. It's put in formaldehyde or formalin solution to help preserve it so that it can be sectioned later when the brain is examined separately. So there's always a brain exam after a brain is removed from the body at autopsy. If you're shot in the head with a bullet or hit in the head with an axe or whatever, they're going to remove your brain, preserve it, and then examine it separately later. So John Stringer was present at a brain exam on Monday after the autopsy, Monday, November 25th, 3 days later. And he remembered that he used certain types of film, Ektachrome, color transparency film, and Kodak black and white film for negatives. So then we showed him the brain photographs in the archives, and he looked at the types of film in the archives, and he said, this black and white film is not Kodak, it's Ansco. It's a brand called Ansco. And he says, I did not use Ansco that night. And in fact, he said, I never did. But he said, I know I did not use it that night on President Kennedy. So the black and white brain photos in the archives are the wrong kind of film. The color film is wrong, too. Should have been, what he shot was Ektachrome, color positive transparencies. And the film in the archives does not say Ektachrome on it, and it has a different type of film notches in the corner. So you can feel the notches in the darkroom with the lights turned off. And he said the notches on these color transparencies in the archives are not the same as the notches on Ektachrome film. So he disowned the brain photos for a different reason from O'Neill, because it was the wrong type of film. And furthermore, he photographed the sections of the brain that had been sliced off, the so-called bread loaf incisions, the serial sectioning of the preserved brain. He photographed those on a light box, one by one. The idea is to photograph each section to record, the bullet damage in successive sections. And no such photographs are in the collection in the archives. There are no photographs of brain sections. So, we know that the brain photographs in the archives of a brain cannot possibly be President Kennedy's brain, because the FBI agent, Frank O'Neill, said, no, there's too much mass present. It's not like the brain I looked at. And the photographer, John Stringer, says they're on the wrong type of film. Furthermore, when he shot the intact brain before it was sectioned, he only shot pictures of it from above. So he shot pictures of the preserved brain only from above before it was sectioned. The photographs in the archives are shot from two angles. Half of them are superior views from above, and the other half are basilar views, so they're views of the underside of the intact brain before it was sectioned. So, that's a major finding. That's one of the major findings of cover-up in this case, is that the brain photos in the archives cannot possibly be of President Kennedy. And sure enough, the brain photos in the archives appear to show damage that would be generally consistent with a shot from behind, which tells us that the missing photographs that were suppressed obviously showed something different, and we know what they showed. All you have to do is study the Dallas doctor's treatment notes, and their sworn testimony is the real brain photos had to be suppressed because they would have shown evidence of shots from the front as well as from behind. They would have shown evidence of crossfire, so they had to be suppressed because it would have contradicted the official cover story. So those are significant highlights, and I'd like to mention one more. Oh, by the way, in regard to the brain, Len, I did a timeline analysis. I was requested to do that by my boss, by Jeremy Gunn, and the timeline analysis of all the previous testimony revealed that there wasn't just one brain exam following the autopsy on the body. There were two. There were two brain exams. One was on Monday, November 25th. That was President Kennedy's brain. The second brain exam was about a week later. It was sometime between November 29th and December 2nd. And so the same attendees, Humes and Boswell, the two Navy pathologists, were present at both brain exams. So that means they were not only privy to the cover-up, they were engineering it, okay? I'm sure they were under orders to do it, but they were engineering this brain cover-up, Humes and Boswell. Stringer was at the first brain exam, Kennedy's brain. He was not at the second one. He's the photographer. Dr. Fink, the third pathologist, he was the Army pathologist who arrived late at the autopsy. Dr. Fink was at the second brain exam, the late event. So it's clear that the photographs in the archives of a brain that cannot be Kennedy's brain, they were taken at the second event. So the whole purpose of conducting a second brain exam was to introduce a substitute brain, a fraudulent specimen, and take pictures of it and pass those off as pictures of President Kennedy's brain, which, of course, it wasn't. And poor Dr. Fink was the dupe. He was the victim of that charade. I think the final highlight that I would want to mention before I give an overview would be the fact that the autopsy report in the archives today, the autopsy report, is the third written version of that document. The first draft of the autopsy report and the autopsy notes were all burned in Dr. Humes' fireplace on Sunday, November 24th. He gave conflicting accounts. He told the Warren Commission he burned the first draft, and then he told the House Select Committee that he burned notes because they had blood on them. And so, Jeremy Gunn had Dr. Humes under oath, and he really zeroed in on him and said, which one was it? Did you destroy the draft or the notes? And finally, Dr. Humes admitted he destroyed both. So he burned the first draft and the original notes, and then there's a second written version of the autopsy report that's now missing. So the first signed version is now missing, and if you can determine that by studying the receipt trail. So all of this is in Chapter 11 of my book. If you want to read about the missing autopsy reports and how the content probably changed each time it was rewritten, it's in Chapter 11. But the very fact that the autopsy conclusions were changing during the week after the assassination tells you that truth was not the only client. It tells you that the truth was very malleable and that the officials in charge of this cover-up were struggling to come up with something that they could sell to people, that they could sell to investigating bodies. And so...
well, explain to me then, how could Lee Oswald use his influence to change and force doctors to burn their notes?
That's exactly the point. Very good, Len. If Lee Harvey Oswald had killed the president, as the Warren Commission claimed, there would be no need to get rid of 18 autopsy photographs, 18 different views times 4. There's no reason to get rid of 18 different autopsy views. There'd be no reason to destroy 2 skull x-rays. There'd be no reason to put altered copy films of the other 3 skull x-rays in the record. There'd be no reason to have a second brain exam and pass off photographs of someone else's brain as the president's. There'd be no reason to do any of these things. There'd be no reason to rewrite an autopsy report twice and get rid of the first draft and get rid of the first signed version. There'd be no reason to do any of that if it was a simple murder like the Warren Commission wanted us to believe. And all of these things are facts. These problems that I'm presenting are not theories, they're facts. And as far as I'm concerned, the hypothesis of Dr. Mantix that the 3 skull x-rays are altered copy films have been verified by deposition of 3 pathologists, and so that's a fact also. And why have substitute records been inserted if it was a simple murder by a lone nut firing from behind at a man in a car? The overview of the medical evidence that I'd like to give is what was going on at Bethesda Hospital that night. And I've given long, extensive talks about this before, including on your show, and I'm going to try to give a shorter version tonight, just an overview. President Kennedy's body arrived early at 6:35 p.m. We know the time because a military non-commissioned officer in charge, a sergeant, Marine Corps sergeant in charge of security at the morgue, wrote a report. He wrote a report on November 26th. His name was Roger Boysian, and his report is about nothing but security for the president's autopsy. That's all his report is about. We came to the Marine barracks. We provided security. In the middle of his report, he says, the casket arrived at 18:35 hours. That's 6:35 p.m. That puts a time on this event. We know from human witnesses like Dennis David and Donald Rubentish that the body arrived in a black hearse and a cheap aluminum shipping casket. That's a problem because the body left Dallas in an expensive, ornate bronze ceremonial coffin. Completely different casket. And that bronze casket was offloaded at Andrews Air Force Base in front of the television cameras at about 6:09 p.m. and put into a light gray Navy ambulance. That ambulance proceeded to make a long, approximately 45-minute drive to Andrews Air Force Base in a motorcade that night. Air Force One landed at 6 p.m. The wheels were on the blocks at 6:04 p.m. The bronze Dallas casket was put in a light gray Navy ambulance. Everybody saw it. Trouble is, President Kennedy's body arrived before the Andrews motorcade. So the body arrives in the wrong car and in the wrong casket at 6:35. Arrives in a black hearse, two people in the front wearing operating room smocks. I believe they're morticians. I believe the car is a hearse belonging to the Gawler's funeral home. And JFK's body arrives early. And so the question is, what's happening to the body between 6:35 when it arrives secretly in the back and 8 o'clock at night when it's brought in again inside the Dallas casket at 8 o'clock? I know now what happened. I'm very sure of it in my own mind, and this is what I'm leading up to in the first 4 volumes of my book. And the summary of my conclusions is in volume 4. President Kennedy's body arrived at 6:35. It had just been flown to the Officers Club parking lot in a helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base. It was not in the bronze Dallas casket. It had been taken out of the casket as soon as the casket was loaded onto the airplane at Love Field. And, the reason that people did that is the Secret Service was terrified that the Dallas police were going to show up with Dr. Rose and demand that they take the body and do an honest autopsy in Texas. I mean, you'll recall, Len, that there was this altercation at Parkland Hospital, a nearly violent altercation with cursing, profanity. The Secret Service agents revealed their weapons, and Dr. Rose, the honest coroner of Dallas County, wanted to conduct an autopsy of President Kennedy's body. Secret Service refused to allow him to do that, said, if you don't get out of the way, you'll be run over with the casket. They had the casket on a church truck. There were 15 or 20 minutes of shouting and profanity that occurred. They stole the body from Parkland, okay? So these people were terrified that the cops would show up at any moment with Dr. Rose and demand the body and do an honest autopsy. And the Secret Service could not permit that under any circumstances because they knew the president had been in a crossfire and driven into an ambush. Some of them were complicit in that. So I think that's why the body was removed from the bronze casket on the airplane as soon as it was taken on board, before the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. Now, why do we know that it was removed? We know because it arrived at Bethesda at 6:35, before the motorcade from Andrews. That body arrived in a black hearse and a shipping casket 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base. So the question becomes, at 8 o'clock at night, there's a different audience. This is the military honor guard, not the security from the Marine barracks, the military honor guard from all the different services, wearing dress uniforms, white gloves. They suddenly find the bronze casket sitting out in front of the hospital in a light gray ambulance after they had lost it in the dark. They chased off after an ambulance, got lost. They were mortified. They lost the body of the commander-in-chief. They thought they didn't know where it was. It suddenly appears out front. They take it in at 8 o'clock at night in the Dallas casket. And at that time, the FBI agents are admitted, and the huge gallery of witnesses, 35 witnesses or so. And the formal autopsy begins shortly after 8 o'clock, when the Dallas casket is taken in. So the question is, what happened to President Kennedy's body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock at night? There's a lot of missing time there. The question is, what was happening? I think what was happening, based on the depositions and the interviews we conducted, the review board staff, is first there was an initial inspection of the real damage to his body. When that body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, there were witnesses that say it still had the same head wound on it that it had in Dallas. A big blowout in the right rear of the head, in the back of the head. Not the top of the head, not the side of the head, the back of the head, the right rear quadrant. Some of those witnesses that testified to that at some point were Dr. Canada, the commanding officer of the treatment hospital, Dr. Berkeley, who later admitted this to a researcher. Canada admitted it to a researcher. Another one was Dr. Ebersol. So after the initial inspection and a quick round of photographs, honest photographs, it's clear to me that Drs. Humes and Boswell, remember Fink wasn't there yet, Drs. Humes and Boswell, before the autopsy began, were ordered to sanitize the crime scene. So these guys, without a large audience present, with only some limited people in the morgue, Navy admirals to be specific, and Dr. Humes and Boswell, they opened up the head wounds, expanded them tremendously, and these guys removed all evidence of shots from the front from the body. I mean, the top of President Kennedy's head was sawed open. Part of the back of his head was sawed open, the top of his head and the right side. All evidence of frontal shots was removed. You know, bullet tracks in the brain were removed. An entrance wound high in the right forehead was removed, in the skin and the bone removed, with a large red incision. And after this illegal clandestine surgery occurred, that's when the skull x-rays were taken, after the crime scene was sanitized. The body's a crime scene. So after the wounds are altered and expanded tremendously, then you have skull x-rays taken, and then you have a first round of photographs taken. And this round of photographs is very misleading because two-thirds of the autopsy photographs today show President Kennedy lying on his back in the morgue. His head is in a stirrup or a metal head brace. So it's very convenient because you cannot see the condition of the back of his head. It's hidden by the head brace. The whole top of his head is missing, and the whole right side of his head is missing in these photographs. Or the right side is severely damaged and folded outwards, bone flaps folded out. The top of the head is missing. And Dr. Boswell drew a convenient sketch on the back of the body chart of the top of the president's head after all this had happened. I presume he drew his sketch after 8 o'clock at night, you know, when this large audience witnessed the sham that was called an autopsy. And the sketch shows the whole top of the head missing. And Dr. Boswell wrote 10 by 17 centimeters missing. And he's clarified to the House Committee and to the review board staff that, yes, 10 by 17 centimeters of bone, this huge area of bone, was missing. So, I view Dr. Boswell's autopsy sketch as a con job. He's describing post-mortem surgery, clandestine surgery done by him and Dr. Humes to remove evidence from the body, evidence of frontal shots, as if it was the damage from the assassin's bullet. The round of autopsy photographs of the president with his head in the head brace showing all this damage to the top and right side of the head, those were all taken after this clandestine surgery. So you got bullet fragments removed from the brain tissue removed from the brain showing bullet tracks, entry wounds in the skin and bone removed from the skull from the front, shots from the front removed, and then photographs taken afterwards, x-rays taken afterwards. So this is the big story about the autopsy. It's fraud in the evidence. The Dallas wound descriptions, these are the treatment notes now, the treatment notes written by the Dallas treating physicians the day the president died, before there's any official story, when the memories were still quite vivid. And this was the same day the event happened. They all universally describe a wound in the right rear of the head, and many of them describe seeing cerebellum severely damaged or actually falling out of the wound onto the treatment cart. So the fact that Dallas doctors and nurses saw cerebellum, specifically the right cerebellum, severely damaged, part of it missing, falling out of the wound onto the treatment cart, confirms that the wound they saw was in the back of the head, not the top, and that it was in the back, not the right side. What you have in Bethesda, we interviewed 3 Dallas Parkland Hospital medical people that the Warren Commission had missed. And 2 of them were Nurse Audrey Bell and Dr. Charles Crenshaw. And we specifically asked them, did you see any damage to the top of President Kennedy's head in Trauma Room 1? And they both said no, and they looked at us like we were crazy. They said, no, we didn't see any damage to the top of his head. We said, did you see any damage to the right side of his head above the right ear? They said no. They looked at us like we were crazy. They said, we only saw damage in the right rear quadrant of the head, in which they interpreted as an exit wound, a blowout. And of course, if you look at the autopsy photographs today, there's no blowout in the back of the head, and the top of the head is missing, and the right side of the head is partially missing and all opened up. So, I mean, there's a major problem here, and this surgery hypothesis of mine, this explanation, explains it. And, David Lifton gets credit for first discovering the key statement. There's been surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. That statement was a direct quote of Dr. Humes made in the FBI report of what they witnessed at the autopsy, the FBI agents, Seibert and O'Neill. And they made clear years later they were only writing down what the doctors said. So the question has always been how to interpret Dr. Humes' remark. And David Lifton always interpreted the remark as Dr. Humes discovering something that someone else did before the body arrived. And I interpret it quite differently. I interpret that remark as an attempt by Humes to distance himself from what he had just done. Because what happened was, first of all, the FBI agents didn't even hear Dr. Humes say that until after 8 o'clock at night. They weren't admitted to the morgue until the body was readmitted in the bronze casket, until this shell game was concluded. So the body's brought back in after it's been tampered with at 8 o'clock. This time it's in the bronze casket like it's supposed to be. The honor guard brings it in. They don't know the difference. They don't know any better. And then the audience, from all the eyewitness accounts, was in a state of disbelief. The head wound was so large. Once the head was unwrapped and once the scalp flaps were pulled back, the head wound was so large that nobody in the audience could believe that it had been done by one bullet. And apparently Dr. Humes panicked. This is my interpretation for his remarks. He panicked and said, well, yeah, somebody's done surgery on the top of the head. Well, of course, there was no surgery in Dallas. So for Dr. Humes to say that, I think it's a panic reaction. It's what a psychologist friend of mine calls dissociation. He's trying to disassociate himself from this from this macabre act that had been done, which the audience wasn't believing that was one bullet. They weren't believing it. Well, he did do it because the timeline does not allow the body to go anywhere else. I mean, Air Force One lands at 6. Wheels are on the blocks at 6:04. There's just enough time for a helicopter to leave Andrews at about 15 after 6 or 6:20. As soon as the lights went out, LBJ's helo takes off. As soon as the lights went out, another helicopter takes off for Bethesda with JFK's body. There's just enough time for it to get there and put it in this black hearse, and for the hearse to show up at the morgue loading dock at 6:35. There's no time for the body to have gone to Walter Reed. There's no time for it to have gone anywhere else. So I conclude the surgery was done at Bethesda. So that's the answer that I've come up with in my book, in much more detail than presented here, for the missing time, because it's a serious missing time problem. What happened to President Kennedy's body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. when it was admitted the second time in the Dallas casket the second time? What happened for that almost hour and a half? Or I guess the last spring is I realized, hey, I did not adequately cover in my book what I think happened with the body on the airplane and how the body got from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Hospital so early. So I wrote a major essay in July, and it's on my blog site, about the Air Force One audio tapes and the events at Andrews Air Force Base and how did the body get to Bethesda at 6:35. So I think that's covered in one essay in much more detail than in the book.
Before we just leave, though, is there any other item that you wanted to bring up or anything noteworthy that we should discuss?
I'd like to speak just briefly about a new witness that came forward about 3 years ago. In 2010, a year after my book came out, I was contacted by someone who said he had been shown an autopsy transparency by his college professor in 1982. It was the winter of 82 or early, it was the late 82 or early 83. This person was a student then at the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. He was a photography student. He described seeing an image of the president after death in this transparency that he was shown. That it clearly indicates it was a photograph that's not in the collection today, because he said it showed an entrance wound very high in the right forehead, high above the right eye in the hairline, and it showed tampering with the tracheotomy in the throat, which is very different from the autopsy pictures we have today, which show the autopsy photos today show a huge gash in the throat, a huge horizontal gash. In the image he was shown, there was a small horizontal slit, like the original horizontal incision, and there was a vertical slit at 90 degrees from that was actually longer than the horizontal slit, and 4 flaps of skin that were peeled back in the photo. So it was an earlier stage of tampering with the tracheostomy before it was turned into a huge gash. But the entrance wound in the forehead was of even more interest. And the reason it's of interest is that two other witnesses, Dennis David, Navy Petty Officer Dennis David, who was a first-class corpsman in '63, and Joe O'Donnell, a USIA photographer at the White House, they were both shown post-mortem photographs of President Kennedy the week following his death that showed such a bullet hole high in the right forehead, an entry wound, about the size of a dime, okay? So this is the third witness that had come forward and seen such a thing. So I've spent 3 years off and on interviewing and re-interviewing this witness. He knows he possesses taboo knowledge. He wants people to know about it. And at the same time, he's concerned because he's an imaging specialist at one of the NASA centers. I'm not going to give you his name. He doesn't want his name released. I'm going to honor his desire for confidentiality. But I've had 3 years to assess his credibility, and I even asked him to send me a sealed transcript. I had the universities mail me, he had the university mail me a sealed transcript of his college matriculation. And it confirmed the 2 degrees that he said he had obtained, and it confirmed the attendance at that university, RIT, and everything else. And the thing that's so disturbing to me is that he was shown this autopsy image and another image, which was probably satellite intelligence photography of an airfield with airplanes on it, as part of a recruiting pitch. People were trying to recruit him to come and work for the government in a highly classified photographic arena. And it was a stranger from out of town that brought the photographs, and the other person was one of his professors. And the professor's name was Professor David Hazy. Now, Professor David Hazy was one of 2 co-authors of an HSCA report on the Oswald backyard photographs. So, I mean, think about this. You got an outstanding student in your photography class. You're trying to recruit him to do intelligence work with photography for the government. You show him an autopsy photograph that's never been seen by anyone else, that's not in the official collection. And your name is David Hazy, and you're the co-author of a report for Robert Blakey that says the backyard photos of Oswald are authentic. The whole thing stinks 10 miles off. So this fellow David Hazy had some special access to some material that the rest of us are not allowed to see. And it was used to try to recruit this young man who they knew, Professor David Hazy knew he had an interest in the assassination. He already knew that. So the student ended up not taking the job that was offered to him. But this event has always bothered him quite a bit, and it's my conclusion that he's telling the truth, and I can only hope that one day he'll come out and reveal his name. But look, he has a top secret clearance at a NASA center. I'm not going to tell you what center. I'm not going to tell you whether he's civil service or contractor. But I believe this guy. And he finally did what I asked him to do, and this is the end of my story here. He commissioned a medical illustrator to draw a version of this color positive transparency, this image of President Kennedy that he was shown, and I was able to present that image at my presentation at Olney College. So this is just one more indicator that the photographic record is a mess and that there's been major suppression of what really happened at the autopsy. And so this would have been one of the photos taken before the clandestine cranial surgery. And it's very and in the image that he recalls seeing, the top of the head was not damaged. So it's a significant new piece of evidence, and I'm sure one day he'll decide to reveal who he is. But right now, he wants to make sure that he keeps his top secret clearance, so
right.
That's his choice. So thanks a lot, Len, for the opportunity to chat with you again. You know, the story of what happened at Bethesda is a complicated story, and you have, if you really want to understand the whole thing, you need to read volumes 1 through 4. It's really quite a story, and all I can tell you is that to conclude tonight is, I think I forgot to mention this earlier, the review board found 2 witnesses to this clandestine surgery. This is not just some Doug Horne idea. There are 2 witnesses that came forward and said they saw it happening. One is Tom Robinson, the young mortician for Gawler Funeral Home, who saw Dr. Hume sawing the back of the head off, what remained of the back of the head off to get the brain out. And Ed Reed recalled Dr. Hume's making a huge incision across the top of just above the top of the forehead, just behind the hairline. And he saw Dr. Hume's making an incision just behind the hairline above your forehead and then opening up the cranium in that area with a circular bone saw. And then he was ordered to leave the room. Said he and his partner, Gerald Custer, were ordered to get out of here, and then recalled 15 minutes later to come down and take the skull x-rays. So we got two witnesses to this stuff happening. And the reason it's so significant is Dr. Hume's always denied that he ever performed a craniotomy. A craniotomy is a removal of the skull cap to get to the brain. A craniotomy is what you normally perform in an autopsy to remove the top of the skull so you can get the brain out and preserve it. Dr. Hume's always said he never had to do that. The bullet wound was so large that he never had to cut the skull off. Well, we got two witnesses that saw it happen, and one of them specifically recalls that it was him doing it. After all, he was the lead pathologist at the autopsy. And so that is why I'm so certain about what happened at Bethesda between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock, is because we found two witnesses. So, and I would encourage people with one final thought tonight. When it comes to matters of science or history, do not defer blindly to the pronouncements of authority. Study all the evidence yourself and make up your own mind, particularly in regard to history, where how do wars begin and how were people assassinated. When it's those hot-button topics, don't let some talking head tell you what you should believe. Study the evidence yourself. It might be a journey that lasts you 10 or 20 or 30 years. Study it yourself, make up your own mind, and you can always keep learning. Don't let somebody make up your mind for you.
All right. Thanks so much, Doug, for being a guest. I'm sure we'll talk to you again.
It was a pleasure, Len. Thanks very much.